Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Thank you for finding your way over here to Harbor B and navigating the maze so that we can have an interesting and exciting conversation about activating the people side of innovation. So my name is Chris Rush. I currently serve as a senior advisor in the Department of Education for Innovation and Improvement. And I'm really excited to dive into sort of another side of the innovation space today. Oftentimes we think about technology and tools and online learning when we think about innovation, but there are a number of dimensions that go to innovation. There's the staffing side, there's the policy side, there are the tool sides, there are new models, there's community engagement. And we want to take a look at how we get people activated and really active in that type of space. So I'd love to introduce our wonderful panel. And I want to thank you all for being here this morning. So first off, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, Cindy Marten. Before joining END, she actually was superintendent right here in San Diego for a number of years, going back all the way to 2013. And before that, she spent, in her career, 32 years as an educator, holding various roles from increasing the access and responsibility for teachers, literacy specialists, vice principal, and principals. So it is a real privilege. Thank you, Cindy, for being here today. Next, we have Tequila Brownie, and she has recently been appointed the CEO of TNTP, the New Teacher Project, which is a national not-for-profit advocacy and consulting sort of focused on disrupting inequalities in public education so that all students have opportunities and can achieve success. She came to TNTP in 2013, and after basically nearly a decade of work in the Memphis city school system, where she led district-wide efforts to improve student outcomes by increasing teacher effectiveness. Next, we're going to turn to Michelle Culver. And she is the founder of the Reinvention Lab at Teach for America, which is an exploratory space working on the future of learning at the intersection of equity and innovation. And then previously, Michelle managed executive directors across 14 urban and rural areas where she was responsible for more than 2,000 teachers, 10,000 alumni, 300 staff members serving over 200,000 students. And then last but certainly not least, we are welcoming David Donaldson, who is the managing partner for the National Center of Grow Your Own, which is a partnership between school districts and educator preparation providers to select candidates from local communities to earn their degrees and educator licenses in order to teach in those local areas. Before that, David served as the former Tennessee Chief of Human Capital, where during his tenure, Tennessee was ranked #1 for prioritizing educator diversity and equity. So I think we have an excellent all-star panel. I'm so excited for the conversation today. So welcome and thank you, everybody. So just as a backdrop for today's conversation, I wanted to share with you the inspiration for today's topic. And before I mention that I serve in the administration focused on innovation and improvement, but before that, I spent about 15 plus years or so working on innovations out in schools across the country, whether or not that was teaching earth sciences back in Pennsylvania, or building ed tech tools at Amplify, or doing some work in New York City Department of Ed, or even building new school models, such as the School of One and Teach to One, to sort of reimagine the fundamental learning experience. My point of telling you this is because I'm about as bought in as a person could possibly be about the need to innovate and to evolve the teaching and learning experience so that it can be more engaging and more sustainable for our teachers, for our students, and for our families. But now I have 2 children myself in the public school system, and I find myself a little uneasy, a little nervous at times about what is actually happening in those classrooms and the new things that they're trying. Do I even agree with the things they're trying to overcome? And again, I very much believe that there is room for improvement, and there's magical things happening in our schools, but there is a lot of work that we still need to do. And if someone like me, who's leading this effort, who has insight of things happening all across the country and has been working on this, if I'm getting nervous about what's happening, if I'm not getting activated in my son and daughter's school district, if I'm actually considering being like, whoa, wait a minute there, something's up. So this is the prompt for today's conversation about how we really start activating people in this space and how we build a broader movement to change and improve things in our schools out there. So that leads us to our first question. So while there's generally agreement that there are problems that need fixing in education, do you believe that there is common understanding and agreement about the cause of those problems? And how do you know? So I'm going to turn to Tequila for this first one.
Thank you, Chris. I would say historically, there has not been enough agreement on the cause of the problems. And part of that, I think, is because we haven't done as good of a job as we've needed to actually talk to people. So in addition to my role now, as CEO of TNTP, I was a school social worker, and then I was also a researcher. So when you put those two sides in my head, in my perspective, I think it's so important to, yes, always look at your data to understand sort of what your data are telling you, but it's equally important to also understand how the experiences of the people that are most affected by the policies and the innovations that we're trying to adapt are actually experiencing the innovations, right? And so you have to understand that, and my evidence, I think, for that, TNTP published a seminal report in 2018 called the Opportunity
Myth.
Yeah, the myth. I'm like, what's the word? The opportunity myth. And in that report, we really talked about student experience. We'd written a lot of reports about what teachers were thinking and feeling, what, principals and others. But that was our first report. We went straight to students and said, how are you experiencing schools? And we learned a lot about the truth about the student experience that then we used to inform our efforts. And that's really key as we think about innovation even today.
Michelle?
I want to say I appreciate even the humility to honor that, it was the first time we turned as adults and said to young people, what do you all want and need? And we've been on a similar journey at Teach for America and in the Reinvention Lab. Since the pandemic started, we've had between 6 and 16 youth leaders sitting on our team as paid parts of our effort. And I will say that there are 3 themes that emerge in my conversations with our youth leaders as different from the adult conversations I'm a part of every day. So 3 things. The first is around mental health, and that's not new to us as adults, but the amount of emphasis of that conversation and the nature of it not being socio-emotional learning or trauma-informed practices as a means to an academic end, but as an outcome in and of itself. When I talk to our young people, they want to live. And they want to live free of anxiety and depression, and a big part of their felt experience of life is in their school learning environments, and this is on their minds. I just saw in the 74, you may have tracked this, 20% of high schoolers have seriously thought about suicide, 9% have actively tried. And so when we talk to our young people, one of them actually said to us, she has a pact with her group of friends where they've agreed not to at night text "I love you" because it creates fear that they're saying goodbye. So this is on our kids' minds, and they are coming up with strategies and solutions independent of us to try to look out and take care of each other. This is very real for them. The second thing is young people today, they're unwilling to accept a whitewashed curriculum or to see the absence of adults who look like them in their schools. The majority of our young people now in this country are kids of color. And there is a greater awareness of identity and racial injustice in this country, and that's part of the conversation they want to be a part of and to see their contributions and cultures reflected positively in their learning experiences. So this is a big part of, I think, creating the conditions in which we start to evolve and change. The third thing that emerges is this question about relevance. And I don't just mean is this lesson going to be interesting to me, but really, is this going to help me get a job that's going to create economic mobility? This is the first generation, as we all know, who are going to grow up with less well off than their parents, and this is on our kids' minds. They're actually making the calculus. If I do this, if I spend my time to get the good grades, to test well, to go to college, to not have the guarantee of a higher paying job on the other side, but possibly debt, This is a calculus they're evaluating in a way that feels very different than even a couple years ago. So I think that our kids would say, no, we're not solving the right problems. And our teachers would agree, because what that means for an educator is that we then say all of these things are true and you have to take on your regular job plus all these things. And our teachers are saying, this is too much. I want it, but my role is not designed to be able to meet all the needs for all of my kids. And so, I've been using the data, I'd be curious if you guys have it, 1 in 4 educators are saying that they're not planning to return next year. I just heard 1 in 3, stress being the major thing.
It went to 1 in 3.
1 in 3. So they're telling us, they're voting with their feet. So we need to try to, I think, hone in on the conditions that would make students and educators feel like, yes, we are clearly on the right problems.
And David, so you spent time working in the state. Do you think states and districts are agreeing or thinking about the same problems that Michelle was just talking about?
Well, I'll say this. I think too often states come up with solutions that are not the problems that districts actually have. Prior to serving as chief in Tennessee, I was chief of talent for Detroit Public Schools. I have that district level lens where many times there would be announcements made where it's like, who'd they even talk to? That's not going to help me be able to do things. So what I'd say is the best examples I see is when it's a unified front and partnership working hand in hand. And so some of the lessons I learned along the way in Tennessee was it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Help folks get those early wins, the things that they have been asking for, often for years, but you got to start by asking them. Even just, it's amazing the engagement that you start with that often doesn't even get asked to begin with. So we made some significant changes to licensure policies. We created a job board. We collected vacancy data for the first time, all things you think would be in place, but were not at the time. And then from there, when I say play your part, unified front, the state was then we did grow your own. And we launched the programs where we set up the program design, the infrastructure, ran the RFP process so that districts, all they had to do was select the candidates, because their immediate focus was filling current positions. They didn't necessarily have the bandwidth or time to be thinking about the future pipeline. Let the state play that part, you focus on immediate needs, and then it will come together long term, and that's what led to successful adoption over time.
So Cindy, you have sort of fresh eyes in a sense, right? You have done this from all the levels along the way. So you're hearing their answers here. What do you think now that you're in this seat on the national level to figure out how we connect the dots? As a parent, which was my opening to this, what should I be taking away from what David and Michelle just said? How do we connect the dots here?
It really is about connecting the dots, and when I heard what each of you said, start with the story that we hear from a father over here who feels disconnected from his child's education, and this is an engaged father who cares about what happens in his kid's school. So what happens, how do you make those connections? And my most recent work was, as Chris said, as superintendent here in San Diego Unified for 8 years, and I spent 32 years, I was a classroom teacher, vice principal, principal, and when you talk about state and federal level policies, like what actually makes it work? What actually makes something, and you said it, is like asking people what they need, asking people what's going to be most helpful, and then figuring out how to design policy from that works the best. And when you do something to a group of people or for a group of people because you think you have the answers, it's very easy to sit outside the system. And many of the public school systems and the schools, we've raised a broken flag in front of every school and said, oh, this school's not working. And then people want to come in and they want to fix it. I'm not about fixing problems. I'm about solving them and about understanding at the root cause, where did those problems begin and how do we actually solve them systemically and do our work in a way that, when I became superintendent, I said the work that we do needs to be systemic, systematic, sustainable, scalable, replicable, and it comes from the voices of the people that we serve. And the people that we serve, yes, I'm serving at the federal level now, but I just finished a call even this morning, one of my colleagues is in the room right now, where we are doing national convenings with roundtables of experts in the field that are as close to the problems that we're trying to solve. As a teacher, we always know, get proximate. The closer you get to a student, the more you know what they need. And we define at the Department of Education, Secretary Cardona and I are very big equity champions. And by the way, the 1 in 3 number, I hate to say this, but maybe they're all at the department, because 1 in 3 appointees at the Department of Education have classroom teaching experience. That's pretty amazing that we have classroom teachers. 1 in 3 of the political appointees have come from the classroom, and so policy is being designed and driven by people who have spent time teaching children in the classroom. That makes a difference. And Secretary Cardona and I, when we define equity, we talk about each and every student gets what they need, when they need it, in the way that they need it. My only caveat I'll put on this is asking people what they need doesn't mean that you as the expert have to not have an idea, because you can't take yourself out of it either. It is about the people. Like the theme of this entire panel is it's about the people. Being the expert, whether you're a principal or a building leader or a system leader or a state leader or a superintendent, whatever role you play or running a nonprofit, you do have ideas. It's when you take your ideas and try to put them upon somebody and do it to them or for them because you know better from, sometimes it's perceived as on high, it's disempowering and disenfranchising. And so how do you do it with? Doing it to and for just doesn't ever work. I wish it did. Like, believe me, I wish that everything I knew that worked in public education, like I think I have the answers. If I could just mandate what matters, we'd be good. Just tell her, just do it because, you know, the department said so, or when I was superintendent because I said so, or because when I was principal, just tell all the teachers what to do. And then if they just all did it, it just doesn't work like that.
Yeah, it's, I think in particular, I want to follow up on the bit that you were talking about, raising the sort of broken flag or the need to fix things. And look, I think schools, just like government or any of us as people and anything we're doing, we're not perfect. It's not 100%, right? There are always opportunities for improvement, but I think we rush to judgment, right? And there's this need to try some things new sometimes in order to address those. But it also means admitting that there is a challenge. So my question to the group is really, look, even when there are times that districts and schools and parents raise their hands saying that they have a challenge, there's a hesitancy at times to try something new. And that can be unwelcome or even rejected. It can lead to protests. I mean, there are some pretty active school board meetings you may hear about in the news for the various things happening. I guess my question to the group is, why, given the acknowledgement that there are these challenges, why do you think this unwelcomeness sometimes exists, this hesitation to actually try something new? Can I turn that back to Cindy, and then I'll head over in your direction, Michelle?
Yeah, I can put on a lot of different hats when I answer that, but I'll put on just my educator hat. When people ask, like on my plane ride over here, like somebody said, oh, what do you do for a living? You know, you just like meet people at the airport, what do you do? I just say I'm a teacher because it's, first of all, Deputy Secretary of Education, that's like way too many, like that's not what I do, that's like what's on my business card. What is our work? And although my job has changed, many of you have changed, we changed jobs, but does our work ever actually change? And when Chris said something about there's a lot of judgment and a lot of like people have ideas wherever you go, everybody has an idea about education because they either went through the system or they have somebody in schools right now and they want to fix it. And they want, and as superintendent, I would have people all the time want to meet with me and want to tell me how to fix the thing that was broken for their child. And I'm a compassionate listener, like I want to hear. And yet there were also people that would come in with the answer. And the answer was coming from the outside. And it might be a great answer. It might be a really spectacular, it might be an answer that I actually used when I was a teacher. It might be an answer that I used when I was a principal. But for me to take an answer that came from the outside and marched into my office looking for a big contract with a big district, San Diego Unified is the second biggest district in the state, 100,000 students, $1.2 billion budget. People are like, get that contract and our program's gonna sail. That's not how you do something. So it's not welcome when it's top down, because when something's top down, the analogy I like to think about is grass, like a beautiful By the way, I hope you all enjoy San Diego. Welcome to my hometown. It's an amazing city. There's lots of green grass everywhere. So gorgeous here. Enjoy the sunrises and sunsets and moonrises. But think about the big grass that's out there behind the hotel. If you put a brick on the grass in the middle of the day and you leave it there all day long, at the end of the day you pick up the brick, what's going to be underneath it? The grass will turn yellow and it will die. When something comes top down like that, it doesn't ever work because you can't take it to scale. You can't replicate it. Now let me flip it, because he's asking, well, why are these things unwelcome? People wanted me to wave the magic wand and say, just do this. And at the federal level too, here's like the answer. Here's the silver bullet, do it. Well, the flip of that is grassroots. It's bottom up. So what happens when it's grassroots? What happens when you actively, meaningfully, authentically, purposefully engage, not checkbox engagement, but really engage with deep listening with the communities that you serve, and the answers come from the bottom up? You get something that's sustainable. You get something that people own, and you activate hearts and minds. And when we think about everything that's been closed during this pandemic in the brick and mortar sense, like schools were closed, churches were closed, things were closed, what has been opened are our eyes to see things we hadn't seen before. Our hearts and our minds have been opened, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. And it's those things that have come up naturally and organically that now pay attention to those, because there's ownership and they're more welcome. And so I'm not against top-down, because, by the way, if you only do grassroots, if you only do bottom-up, you will not ever deliver on the hope and promise of education. You will not have equity, because you will get, some will have green grass and some will have weeds and some will have, it doesn't totally work, grassroots. You need a top-down strategy that's a systemic approach to something when you're trying to do systems change. And this is when I was a building principal. I wanted all my classrooms to be high-quality, rigorous academic learning experiences that valued each student. But I didn't want cookie-cutter classroom. The same thing when I was a superintendent. I didn't need every school to be exactly the same, but there were common principles. So how do you design, if you want things to be more welcome, and you want to take the broken flag down and raise it's working, do it in a way that you have the bottom-up strategy along with top-down, a vision around what equity is going to look like across your system.
Michelle, how would you respond to that?
Well, I love the brick and grass metaphor. And so the question I'm asking myself is, when things grow, why? And I think there's two things I might offer for that based on work that I see in what we're building here at Teach for America, and also what I see in the Reinvention Labs network. So the first is that we're really responding to what young people are pulling towards them. And the second is that we're making adults' jobs, the things that they need to do anyway, already easier. So there's sort of momentum and lift, even though there are often different interests at different levels. And that's part of the challenge of designing innovation when you have so many stakeholders. So in our own work right now, we have a recent new thing that we've built called Ignite. It's a tutoring program. And we currently have, at this moment, 500 college students who are Zooming into classrooms across 9 different communities in urban and rural contexts. Now, tutoring is not new. That's not an innovation in and of itself. But this is a new delivery mechanism at scale that we see real potential in. And part of the reason why it's moving so quickly is that as our tutors are working with young people, and we are intentionally choosing to do that in groups of 3 or 4, we've focused on belonging. Because when we asked kids how they were feeling about coming back to school, that was what they were telling us. And so it wasn't enough for us to think about academic support absent what we knew was on the hearts and minds of our young people. So youth are pulling it towards them, and at the same time, we're working in partnership with schools where we already have pre-existing relationships, and we're able to use their curriculum. So the things that the adults already need to get done, we're making it easier for them to do that. We're now going to triple, and we cannot keep up with demand for this program. And we see this with our network. We have these incredible group of innovators who are taking very different approaches. One that I love, Brittany Young, who does Beast 360 out of Baltimore. It's this incredible program where it's dirt bike programming, dirt bike culture around STEM learning. And so young people are pulling it to them because it's so exciting, it's so experiential, it's so resonant, and it helps adults know and trust that their kids are in an environment outside of the school day where it's safe, it's identity affirming, it is positive, and so it's giving lift to something that have multiple needs. You see this Rock by Rock as a new emerging product that I think has real promise, because Sungye and Jeff have been understanding that kids want to affect the world around them. So they've designed curriculum, it's changemaker curriculum, it's standards aligned, project-based learning. And so what you see is that it's because this is relevant content for our kids, they're pulling it to them, and they've designed this for homeschool parents. So it's incredibly easy. You don't have to be a trained educator to deliver this tech platform and content. So it's really easy. It's giving lift to these parents who want the best for their kids. So I think this is sort of the balance of these two things. But what I really hope happens, and this is not yet the bar, I mean, this is the bar, but it's not yet in practice. Mark Murphy, who was the commissioner of education in Delaware, now leads an organization called Grip Tape. And Grip Tape exists outside of the school day, but there's wisdom in this. 100% of the kids who go through this program, where they set a goal for themselves and practice developing agency towards achieving that goal, 100% of the kids are a net promoter. They do no advertisement, and they keep doing all of this through word of mouth. Young people are pulling this towards them because it's meaningful learning that resonates for them. And I want that bar for our innovations in our school districts.
One of the things I'm overwhelmingly hearing from this group is that some of the challenges, whether or not things have been unwelcome for some of the things that are happening, or things that haven't been effective, is because we don't necessarily have everybody working together. We don't have our teachers, our communities, our innovators, our providers sort of working together in that. And if they are going to be involved, if we are going to involve more folks in those efforts, my question to you, and then I'm going to turn it to some questions from the audience, I'll start with you, Tequilla, on this one, is, okay, so we need to involve our educators, our parents, our communities in this more. How can we do that? Because they already have a lot going on. I have a lot going on as a parent, and teachers have a lot going on as well, so is this just another thing we're putting on their back?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that I remember well when I was a school social worker is really thinking about fragmentation. And by that I mean there are a lot of strings being pulled towards folks' time and in disparate ways, right? It's not coordinated, it's not working towards a common purpose. And so one of the things that we've been doing at TNTP is actually working with communities towards first, okay, let's agree on your common purpose and establish a true coalition, because when we talk about partnership and we talk about voice with communities, one of the first prerequisites, I would say, is making sure that, yes, I agree, it's absolutely with Deputy Secretary that it has to be authentic. The other one is that you have to go in with a more of an asset mind frame versus a deficit. People know when you show up and you're like, and I'm seeing you as a problem to solve and to fix, not something that, okay, you have assets. And so how we've approached that is going in, to your point, yeah, we bring our wisdom, our expertise, and all those things, but more so we're able to bring together people to help the community, all the stakeholders identify common purpose, which is, if you talk to folks, like you said, families, communities want their communities and individuals to thrive. That means that first and foremost, the children, the students have to be set on a bar for success. I'll loosely paraphrase Gandhi and then I'll close. He says, a community is known by how well it treats its children. And so when you go across the country and we work with communities, they say, okay, it's not just about the standards or these low things. It's about, okay, how are we helping kids from poverty escape poverty? How are we helping the next generation of children be excited and contributing to their own lives and our workforce and our national economy and our national good? And that's what we hear from communities and from families. They all want that, and then it's a matter of, okay, what is my role in that true partnership and in that true coalition?
David, I'll give you last word on this particular one, and then we will open up to some questions from the audience.
Sure. So, we know the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so one of the things we did in Tennessee is we put together a TASPA, Tennessee Association of School Personnel Administrators, kitchen cabinet. We met with 10 to 12 chiefs of talent at the district level every 4 to 6 weeks. We also had a similar group for superintendents, and we would talk with them all the time. And I want to double down on one of Tequila's earlier responses. We would come to them with the data, and we'd say, here's what we see. And what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, but just because you can measure it doesn't mean it's meaningful. I have the quantitative side. I have some assumptions. But you tell me, what's the qualitative? What am I not seeing? What is the data not showing? Put the faces to the data. Put your experience to this data to help us understand what is happening here. And from there, we start to then, and I want to then double down on something Deputy Secretary said, we started proposing answers. And the best relationship was the folks playing the role of editor. We like parts of what you're saying, David, but if you make this change, and this change, it will actually work. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Let's make those changes. I think the core thing to remember in this is at the end of the day, they were the ones implementing the work, not me. So it doesn't matter how good an idea is if people don't want to do it and they're not going to implement it with fidelity.
I think that's great. And if I bring it back to my opening prompt about me engaging as a parent now, I would love to play editor to some degree in that. Not that I'm the expert on it, but how I tend to be engaged, and I'm not trying to rag on my kid's school district, is more that like, hey, we need bottled water and we need paper towels that actually absorb water instead of those brown ones that we've all seen in schools before. And it's a very different conversation than I think the one that's being described up here. So I think it's very exciting.
Chris, can I add one thing to this too? Just expand the possibilities of role. Editor, that relationship is a alternative to the patterns we typically have. Another one I'll put in the mix is co-creation. And so I will say this is a value that I'd had for a while, but turns out getting into action on it and doing it well and consistently requires a level of humility that I have been deeply proximate to for the last couple of years. But I invite the group to, if this is of interest to you, share some of the learnings of some very specific tasks that we've been testing and codifying over the last couple of years about how to be in a relationship with young people and adults where there's actually shared power. So it's not that I hold the pen, it's not that you have the pen, it's not that they're right or you're right, but you're actually putting all of the perspectives around the table and creating the conditions where you can get something very different as a result. And so we've been able to say, here are the things that we thought would happen, and then in practice, here's what happened instead. This is what makes it increasingly better or more challenging to disrupt those patterns. So if you're interested in that, I certainly make ourselves available to share some of those learnings as well.
Great. Well, I invite anybody in the audience to put forth a question. You can ask as a professional, as a parent, as an educator, whatever lens or hat you're feeling you have a question about.
You could use a teacher voice, too.
Folks online won't be able to hear then. I'm Robin Furman. I am the president and CEO of Enactus, a global nonprofit organization that's training university students all around the world to be social innovators, addressing the SDGs. And I'm curious, in terms of the principles that each of you spoke about of how we do change work well, what have you noticed and what are you doing with your teams and your staffs to cultivate and continue to cultivate the culture that is required to lead in this way, which can be so countercultural, particularly in the US? Or how are you selecting folks from the beginning?
Jump ball.
Sure, I'll jump in. So TNTP we're a remote organization, about 600 full-time staff, and so the culture really matters, right? Because it's not like I'm going to bump into you at the water cooler and overhear you sort of not representing our culture. We've made a very intentional journey to do, and my grandmother would say, sweep around your own front door first. And so how can we be authentic in doing equity work with districts if we're not facing that internally? And so we've been on this journey for literally about 10 years now. Before, everybody was out hiring a new chief diversity officer. We started doing that work then, and it was really focused on a lot of learning and self-reflection and self-awareness. But then actually activating that, to your point, because knowing that, okay, here's what, equity looks like and what it doesn't, but then what are you going to do about it, and being more self-aware about opportunities to disrupt equity that we actually have all sort of, to your point, passed over. So that learning journey, and very intentional in both internally, how we work with one another, to the point about co-creation, paying attention to who's in your network, who you talk to, who you go to for answers, who you even trust. I mean, a lot of this comes down to trust. We didn't really raise that here between communities and us innovators, if you will. Trust is broken, right, in a lot of ways. Communities of color for decades, centuries, have had folks come in to fix them or plant a seed or do something, and then they disappear. No different internally with our teams. We really focus on that and think about strategic ways and intentional ways and actions to show and demonstrate trust and shared journey together.
I look for people who know how to leave their ego at the door, and they don't worry about their salary, they don't worry about what's on their business card, they don't think that they have all the answers. What they know how to do is gather people to talk about the things that they care about the most. And to assume that you have the answer for somebody else's problem takes away somebody's power and voice and agency. And I'm looking for people that know how to create agency in others. You see people's strengths, gifts, talents, and abilities, their languages, their cultures, and what they're bringing to any conversation. That voices they matter, they're heard, and you create from that, and you create a synergy. And people that know how to do that know how to work with the invisible and the magic of bringing people together, are people that are going to create solutions that, if they come in with the answer and they just want the big title and the big salary so they can make everybody do what they know works, you could just be guaranteed, as good as the idea it won't work. And I apply 2 theories of action. One is by a man named Jerry Sternin. He unfortunately passed away, but at a young age, but he had done some incredible work around positive deviance. And positive deviance is where you have deviant behavior, meaning it's different than the norm, and it yields positive results. And he was charged with solving world hunger, and he would go into villages in Vietnam and figure out where there was where children weren't starving. And he would figure out the solutions, like, wait, how did they figure that out? He came from the United States as a medical doctor. He knows how to solve child nutrition problems. But when he went to Vietnam, if you just bring the United States solution to child nutrition and plop it into a village in Vietnam, the kids will eat for a day or two, and then it'll be over. So the solutions came from within the community. And the positive deviance approach is deviant behavior yields a positive norm. He would find where kids were doing well. Like, oh, how did they do that? The 3% of the kids that are well-nourished in this community, why are they well-nourished? And lean in and get proximate, and if 3% can be well-nourished, I'm making up the statistics, it wasn't 3%, whatever it was, but you would lean in and go, oh, they figured out these 4 things that are local, that work, that can happen, and you can spread to the rest of that village. That village is now well-nourished. Then you go to the next village. And the second theory of action, besides positive deviance, that's like a ground-up strategy that gets systemic. It's appreciative inquiry. What you appreciate appreciates. What you pay attention to is what grows. If you pay attention to what's broken, you're going to get more of what's broken. If you pay attention to what's working, however small, you get it right for one kid, okay, that worked. Appreciate that, figure out why, get underneath the craft of that caused that result, appreciate it so that it can grow and stay in an inquiry stance, not a place of judgment. Whenever I go to starting to judge anybody or anything, I check myself. What do you say, check yourself before you wreck yourself? Like, check yourself. Like, do not judge. I go to inquiry, and I go to, that's interesting. I'm going to make an observation, not a judgment, over something that doesn't match my paradigm, so I can understand where it's coming from. And I look for people that can have those mindsets.
To that last point, may I add, I think this is so important because right now, folks are so tired. and they're working so hard. And so this idea of being able to do that, to foster a radical imagination, we simply will not transform learning right now for kids unless we can dream into a picture that is unlike what we are experiencing right now. So when we can find those examples from our communities where there are innovators who've been doing alternatives that are working and have existed, when we can uplift those and learn from them, it also unlocks the creativity that we so desperately need in order to imagine a reality very different from the one that we have today.
We're in our last moment or two, so I'm going to take this moment to not only say thank you to everybody on the panel, but to do one last round robin on this closing question, about 30 seconds each, because we need to leave space for the room for the next group that's coming in. So I'll get you out on this. What do you expect and hope to see in schools in the next few years? What do you think the priorities should be? And David, I'll start with you, and we'll just go right down the line.
Yeah, really quick, I am very optimistic about the future of diversifying the profession through Grow Your Own and registered apprenticeship programs, specifically creating a world where individuals can become teachers for free and get paid to do so. I'm incredibly excited that Secretary Cardona called on all 50 states to establish that. And then also really quick, I think there's going to be even more innovation happening once teachers are healed. And I think there has been so much attacks on these professions, and they don't get enough credit, but Secretary Cardona, Deputy Secretary, you all are doing an incredible job letting people know they are seen and heard, and once teachers get their mojo back and they've been working their butts off, we're gonna see a lot more innovation in the future, and I'm really excited for that.
Gosh, I think what I really hope is that we tend to the moment. This is a moment. I've now been in education for over 25 years, and this is unlike any other opportunity to pause and ask a different set of questions. So my hope is that teachers, students, their parents, our community members, our innovators are courageous enough to ask, what is the purpose of learning? What is the purpose of education today? Why do our kids need to learn? And therefore, depending on how you answer that, what are the outcomes? And then how might we achieve those? With whom can deliver it? Not just a single trained educator, but the importance of a single trained educator alongside perhaps a very different group of people from the community to support those kinds of new learning methods. And then how do we make that equitable for all? So I'm not interested in a single answer, but the conditions in which lots of people are interrogating new questions with a multitude of answers to help us really radically re-architect what the education system can be for all of our young people.
I hope to see schools that actually appreciate and understand that there are multiple pathways for children to experience economic and social mobility. And we actually don't recognize schools in the sense that we break down those false walls between community, between K-12, between post-secondary, and between industry. And so there are talented folks from all of those sectors in schools helping kids on their journeys from kindergarten.
And we just want to deliver on the Secretary's priorities, because inside those priorities is building school systems that give children what they need, when they need it, in the way that they need it, which is what equity truly is. And it's based on the science of learning and development. If the science is what got us out of this pandemic, the arts, I say, get us through the pandemic. The science gets us out. It's the science of learning and development that gives children the learning conditions that allow them to thrive and to grow with this sense of belonging in every classroom. And that's what our priorities are about at the department. So we'll continue to do that work and watch it happen across the country.
Well, I love this, and this vision that you are all putting forth about how people can work together, how we can solve problems. I hope that what I see over the next few years is that we don't just talk about that on stage, or people aren't just putting out reports on it, but that when I talk to families and teachers out there, they are feeling what you are talking about, and that becomes part of their life and their lived experience. So for what it's worth, I thank everyone here for taking the time to listen and participate today. Hopefully things here you can take forth and put into practice to some degree where you are and help be part of that change. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the time at your conference.
Thank you, Chris.